Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. I got a video suggestion from a viewer the other day that I thought would be a really good one to address because I'm sure if one person's struggling with it, there's a lot of you guys out there that are struggling. And the suggestion was to do a video regarding how to be successful during a shad die-off. We've just had a major cold front that went through a good portion of the country. There is a lot of lakes that have ice coverage that generally don't have ice. And anytime you talk about falling water temperatures, to the point, especially where you're having ice on some of your lakes, what we tend to see is a pretty good shad kill. And when a shad kill happens, that can lead to some very, very difficult fishing. And it just has to do with the fact that there is a lot of forage for not just bass, but all game fish to feed on without expelling much energy. If you're talking about having a shad kill based on water temperature, that means you've got water temperatures that dropped well into the 40-degree mark, if not cooler. And the shad don't handle that well. And you can have major, major shad kills because of that. Well, what happens when the shad die is they tend to fall to the bottom. Everyone thinks that, dead fish that we see floating around are what happens when the fish die. But the reality is the fish actually sink to the bottom first and they sit on the bottom until their body starts decomposing, which builds up gases. That then floats them to the surface, and then they usually get washed ashore when they're on the surface. But before they get to that point, they actually fall to the bottom. A lot of times you have a lot of fish that are kind of fleeing on the bottom. They try to get off the bottom and then they fall back to the bottom, try to swim away. Then they're just suffering and they can't survive. And when that happens, you have a ton of shad that have fallen to the bottom and become extremely easy meals for the game fish out there to feed on them. And that creates really difficult fishing because if the fish have a ton of forage and they don't have to expel much energy for it, they're not nearly as willing to chase an artificial lure. And because of that, it does create a lot of difficult fishing for anglers. But there's a couple things that I like to do to combat that. So the first, and this may sound counterintuitive, I actually prefer to fish areas that I feel like don't have a ton of bait fish in them. There is definitely a good population of fish that move with the bait fish and always are around the bait fish, but there's also a good percentage of fish that live in certain areas. And if the bait fish are not in those areas, they still tend to live in those areas. And by targeting fish that are not strictly keying in on, say, shad, I can kind of take the shad out of the equation and try to fish for the fish that may be keying in on, say, bluegill or something along those lines. So the first thing I try to do is actually move away from where the big shad kill has been. Now, if you can't really get away from that, then what I'm going to be looking to do is key in on specific targets that are in those areas. So maybe you've got a very defined break line, maybe you've got stumps, maybe you've got a giant rock. If I can fish an isolated target that I know generally are home bases for bass, that's going to up my odds to put my bait in front of a fish that is actually not that active. The other thing I'm going to do is try to use reactionary baits that are going to get fish to react to my bait, even if they're not looking for their next meal. So once I've kind of identified the areas that I want to fish, you need to recognize the baits that are going to be the best in those areas. So generally speaking, and I think this might be counter intuitive to what a lot of people think, I'm actually not going to fish baits that are higher up in the water column. I want to keep my baits closer to the bottom. If I'm fishing in 20 feet of water, I want to be in the bottom 5 foot of the water column. And that has to do again with the fact that when shad are dying, they're falling to the bottom. So if a lot of fish are feeding during this time period, they're feeding closer to the bottom and they're relating more to the bottom. You also have to keep in mind that if this is occurring, it's because we have super cold water temps. And generally, the majority of the population of fish are going to be deeper in the lake, anyways, because the deeper water holds more heat. Now, that's not always the case, but a good portion of the fish will be lower in the water column because there is more stable water temperature, and a lot of forage with a shad kill. So if I'm looking to choose some baits, two of my absolute favorites during this time period are going to be a um, some sort of deep blade bait, whether this is the depths that I really like, the circuit vibe, a great one. The silver buddy's a great one, but the reason I really like to throw blade baits is because they go down to the bottom quick, they stay on the bottom, and when I slowly work them back, they actually look like a dying shad that tries to get off the bottom, falls right back down, and it's just a pretty good bait at mimicking a lot of the shad. A lot of the shad too that tend to die off are the younger ones, the smaller ones, or the unhealthier ones, but the smaller ones a lot of times. And your blade baits are really good baits at mimicking that. Along those same lines, your lipless crankbaits, more specifically, I really like ones that have a thinner profile, almost more like the blade bait. This is the Berkeley Jack series. Great baits, it's staying down deep, and again, allowing you to work through those areas where there's a lot of shad that are already on the bottom. But these two baits are actually going to be two of my absolute go-tos during a shad kill. They're also really good at just fishing deeper water, which is a lot of times where you're going to be looking as well. Now, obviously, a couple other good baits that mimic your bait fish would be your swim baits. So this is just a Kitech Fat Impact. This is a 3.3 on a core tackle tush jig head. Really good bait for mimicking your shad. Again, I'm going to be fishing this really slow though. I'm going to be working it to try to keep my bait as close to the bottom as possible. Generally just a really slow straight retrieve, just trying to create an easy opportunity for the bass to ambush it. Um, just a really classic bait for fishing during a shad kill. Another one, obviously, would be your jerk baits. Now, the jerk bait, again, for me, is going to be a better bait to throw in the shallower water column areas. So if I'm fishing 15 foot of water or less, I'm going to be choosing a jerk bait like the Berkeley Stunna here that dives roughly to within a couple feet of the bottom. So if I'm fishing 12 feet of water, probably going to throw a Stunna +1. If I'm fishing 15 feet of water, I'll try to throw the Stunna 112 +2. And if I'm fishing 5 foot of water, I might go with, the 100 size, the smaller size. But the idea here is to get your jerkbait down to the level that the fish are truly at in feeding without having to draw them a long ways off the bottom. Jerkbait's absolutely great bait at doing that. So those are the baits I'm going to be using if I'm around the shad. But remember, early in this video, I said I actually didn't want to fish around the shad if I didn't have to. In those instances, a lot of times I'm going to be fishing a little bit shallower. I'm going to be fishing bank related areas, and I'm going to be fishing bass that are not necessarily feeding on shad. They're going to be usually feeding on more of your bluegill or some of the other smaller forage species. And from that standpoint, I'm going to be going with baits like a jig. So if I'm fishing really specific targets, so whether a laydown tree or docks, places where I know the fish live, I love a little jig. This is the Tungsten Little Spotty by Picasso with a 3-inch pit boss on the back. Just a great combination. A jig is just a really good bait for fishing during this time period because, again, those fish that are up shallow are generally relating tight to cover because they're holding near those items, not necessarily as ambush locations, but almost more so because they're areas that absorb heat during this cold water period. And if it holds heat, it probably is a good piece of cover for a jig. So from that standpoint, a jig is one of my favorites. And then also some of your smaller running square bill style crankbaits. This is the Berkeley Fritz side. Just an absolute great bait for covering a lot of water, and fishing things like your riprap. Maybe you've got some shallow stumps, some shallow laydowns. Those are going to be things that I'm going to be targeting during a shad kill when I'm actually not trying to fish the shad kill, if that makes sense. These are some of my absolute go-to baits anytime I'm fishing during this time period where you have a lot of those shad that are killed or that are died off, and you've got your cold water that have caused it. So hopefully this helps answer that viewer question. Hopefully it points you in the right direction. You can catch a few extra fish. If you've got some other advice for this angler, please put it in the comment section so they can learn from you guys as well. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel, guys, hit that subscriber button and become a subscriber to the channel. It would mean a lot to me. So thanks for watching, guys. Stay tuned. We'll have a new video coming out tomorrow.